But the problem is that objective values do exist, and deep down I think we all know it. There's no more reason to deny the objective reality of moral values than the objective reality of the physical world. Actions like rape, cruelty, and child abuse aren't just socially unacceptable behavior, they're moral abominations. And here Dr. Dacey agrees with me. In his book, The Case for Humanism, co-authored with Lewis Vaughn, they state, if a moral theory sanctions, say, the inflicting of undeserved and unnecessary suffering on innocent children, we must conclude that something is very wrong with the theory. Indeed, even Michael Roos himself admits the man who says it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. Some things, at least, are really wrong. Similarly, love, equality, and self-sacrifice are really good. Hence, I think we all know, number 2, that objective values do exist. But then it follows logically and inescapably that 3, therefore, God exists. Number 5, the historical facts concerning the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, was a remarkable individual. New Testament critics have reached something of a consensus that the historical Jesus came on the scene with an unprecedented sense of divine authority, the authority to stand and speak in God's place. He claimed that in himself the kingdom of God had come, and as visible demonstrations of this fact, he carried out a ministry of miracle working and exorcisms. But the supreme confirmation of his claim was his resurrection from the dead. If Jesus did rise from the dead, then it would seem that we have a divine miracle on our hands, and hence evidence for the existence of God. Now, most people probably think that the resurrection of Jesus is something you just believe in by faith or not. But there are actually 3 established facts recognized by the majority of New Testament historians today, which I believe are best explained by the resurrection of Jesus. Fact number 1, on the Sunday following his crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. According to Jakob Kramer, an Austrian specialist in the study of the resurrection, by far most scholars hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb. Fact number 2, on separate occasions, different individuals and groups saw appearances of Jesus alive after his death. According to the prominent New Testament critic of Vanderbilt University, Gert Ludemann, it may be taken as historically certain that the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. These appearances were witnessed not only by believers, but also by skeptics, unbelievers, and even enemies. Fact number 3, the original disciples suddenly came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. Jews had no belief in a dying, much less rising Messiah, and Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead before the end of the world. Nevertheless, the original disciples came to believe so strongly that God had raised Jesus from the dead that they were willing to die for the truth of that belief. N.T. Wright, an eminent British scholar, concludes, that is why, as a historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. Attempts to explain away these 3 great facts, like the disciples stole the body or Jesus wasn't really dead, have been universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. The simple fact is that there just is no plausible naturalistic explanation of these facts. And therefore, it seems to me, the Christian is amply justified in believing that Jesus rose from the dead and was who he claimed to be. But that entails that God exists. Thus, we have a good inductive argument for the existence of God based on the resurrection of Jesus. Number 1, there are 3 established facts about Jesus: the empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. 2, the hypothesis God raised Jesus from the dead is the best explanation of these facts. 3, the hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, entails that God exists. 4, therefore, God exists. Finally, number 6, you can experience God personally. This isn't really an argument for God's existence. Rather, it's the claim that you can know that God exists wholly apart from arguments simply by immediately experiencing him. This was the way people in the Bible knew God. As Professor John Hick explains, God was known to them as a dynamic will interacting with their own wills, a sheer given reality, as inescapably to be reckoned with as destructive storm and life-giving sunshine. To them, God was not an idea adopted by the mind, but an experienced reality which gave significance to their lives. Now, if this is so, then there's a danger that arguments for God can actually distract your attention from God himself. If you're sincerely seeking God, then God will make his existence evident to you. The Bible promises, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. We mustn't so concentrate on the external proofs that we fail to hear the inner voice of God speaking to our own hearts. For those who listen, God becomes an immediate reality in their lives. So in conclusion then, we've seen 6 reasons to think that God exists. If Dr. Dacey wants us to believe atheism instead, then he must first tear down all 6 of the reasons that I presented, and then in their place erect a case of his own to prove that atheism is true. Unless and until he does that, I think we can conclude that theism is the more plausible worldview.
If you notice a strange look on any of our faces, it's because we're sitting on the movable platform, and even the applause caused it to go back and forth. But I assure you, it's very safe. It won't fall out from under you. Dr. Dacey, you have 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks very much to the Campus Crusade for Christ here at Purdue and the Wabash College Free Thought Society for making all this possible. It's always nice to return to the Midwest, where I was born and raised. The last time I was back in Minnesota was a few years ago for my 10-year high school class reunion, and my classmates couldn't believe that I was still in school, getting my degree in philosophy of all things. They kept asking me, what are you going to do with that? To which I used to reply, think deep thoughts about unemployment. But I don't know whether they'd be relieved or horrified to see that I've found something to do with my philosophy here tonight. Like many of those I grew up with as a young teenager, I was a born-again Christian, and although I no longer have that faith, the questions of God and meaning and morality have always remained close to my heart, and if there's one thing that Dr. Craig and I can agree on, I'm sure it's on the importance of a reasoned public discussion of these questions. I'm really honored to share the stage with him, and thrilled that you all could be here tonight. You might think it's just futile to argue that God doesn't exist because one can't prove a negative. Actually, there are a couple of ways to prove that a thing doesn't exist. One is to show that the thing couldn't possibly exist because the very idea of the thing literally makes no sense, like a round square. And the other way is to look very carefully and see if it's there. If you look as best you can for a thing and you still don't find it, then you can sometimes reasonably conclude that it isn't there. Both methods have been employed to show that God doesn't exist. Many have argued that God is like a round square, that some of his properties, like being all-knowing and transcending time and space, are incompatible. Because our time together is limited tonight, I will not defend any of these conceptual or incompatible property arguments against theism. I'll just point out that they do have defenders, and I invite you to look into them if you haven't done so already.